Black healing. And this topic today is going to focus on some recent events. Recently, on March 25th, 2016, the United Nations passed a resolution that related to slavery, and it declared slavery as the gravest crime against humanity. After this ceremony took place, of course, it was published that it was going to occur. Many black people were aware of it. Evidently, many were not. And but it was attended by a number of different black leaders were involved in it and participated. And it also involved the Congressional Black Caucus and involved other leaders like Reverend Al Sharpton and the great attorney who has worked so many civil rights cases in the black community, as well as a number of other people. And so in terms of, I had a disturbing experience the other day, and that was I was listening to someone who is a leader of the FBA. I won't say their name, but what they, of course, they filed a patent, or I'm sorry, a trademark to own the FBA name and the FBA brand. And it's being, the FBA brand has been promoted, as personal property of someone who is representing white supremacists and is attempting to create a divide within the black community. And one of the things they did was they attacked this event, and they attacked the president of Ghana, who was the main spokesperson on behalf of the UN that gave the presentation, particularly at the event at the United Nations and also at the African burial site and in Lower Manhattan, New York. And they attacked him, saying that him and the Africans were trying to take reparations away from black Americans, that they were inserting themselves into this situation and trying to take away our bag, is the way they described it, and insert himself into our business and our quest for reparations. And what I want to do, I want to talk about the whole context of this, and so that we can understand just simply how ridiculous that argument and that view is. So I want to continue to focus on this issue in terms of the ideal of black healing. First of all, let me just say, and I'm going to say this, I'm going to say that some of the information, I'm going to share some information today that may be new to some people, and it will also perhaps be eye-opening, and I think that it also has the capacity that if we really think on it, to help us begin the healing process. Let me first start out by saying that black people worldwide have suffered multi-generational trauma as a result of the African Holocaust. Very often, when I use this term, African Holocaust, many people cannot really grasp the scope and the depth of what it means when I say the African Holocaust, because the African Holocaust actually involves about 68 generations that where since the time that the first invasions took place into Nubia and the beginning of race-based chattel slavery. There's always been some form of slavery in human history, and most of it is really a type of servitude situation where, it's not for life. It's not where you lose your humanity or any of those things. People were in debt, or they were prisoners of war, or they committed a crime or whatever, and they got into some type of servitude or bondage as a retribution for those types of activities. And which is very, very different from chattel slavery, because chattel slavery was a system where a doctrine was developed that actually dehumanized black people and classified black people as kind of subhuman, to be less than a regular human being. And they've used various different arguments. They've had the nature argument, as well as that it was a result of some type of divine curse on black people. So they've used all kinds of things. And many people think that it started out with the Europeans, the modern Europeans, but it actually started out with the Aryan descendants, the Indo-Europeans, who migrated into the Arabian Peninsula and started the religion of Islam. And so in 652 CE, we have the invasion into Egypt was invaded in about 642, and then they went south and began to attack Nubia and enter into sub-Saharan Black Africa. And they entered with this doctrine of a supremacy doctrine that said that black people were black because of the curse of Canaan, that we were excluded from the human family, and that our role and job was to be slaves, to be their servants. And they came with this doctrine, and this marked the beginning of the trans-Sahara slave trade that was race-based chattel slavery, where you weren't indentured, you weren't, you were basically a slave for life, and you were no longer classified as a human being, but you were given the status of chattel, of property. And so black people found themselves in a position where they began to suffer untold trauma. And this happened over a period of time. It actually happened and continued for about 68 generations. And at one point, it was taken over about little more than 20 generations ago. Europeans took this over from the Arabs. And so in terms of the Arabs in the Islamic world, which would include the Turks, the Persians, and etc. But it's multi-generational trauma that took place. And this involved the what we call the African Holocaust, because it not only consisted of the devastation of the African continent itself, it also consisted of the trans-Sahara slave trade, which took about 11 million people in slavery, the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade, which took about 9 million sub-Saharan black people into slavery, and the transatlantic slave trade, which took about 12.5 million people into slavery, a total of about 32.5 million black people taken from the African continent. And they were distributed all over the world. In over 100 countries they were taken to, including the United States, or what became the United States. They were taken to the 13 British colonies that became the United States. And it's sometimes difficult for people to really wrap their head around the magnitude of worldwide YT supremacy and how it was organized on a global scale. And you can look at the various empires like the British Empire and see its global footprint, all of the countries that it involved in and controlled, and where its colonial territories were located. You can see the same thing for the Ottoman Empire and see its footprint globally and the lands where black people were taken through the Islamic slave trades. And so in terms of looking at this, when we began to drill down, and there's so much information that it's a substantial study, but over 100 million people were unalived on the African continent itself. And when we look at on the African continent during this Holocaust, over 100 million people. And you can just look at, for example, for the short period between 1884 and about 1907, some 10 to 15 million people were unalived in the what was known as the Congo Free State by the Belgians, by King Leopold. Some 10 to 15 million in that short window of time. So when we look at the numbers, the official numbers, and we begin to try to examine, we put that number 100 million out there. This is the most conservative number because the numbers are likely substantially higher than 100 million people unalived, because you can look at just that window in the so-called Congo Free State. You can also look during that same period of time after the Berlin Conference in 1884 and see in Southeast Africa the development of De Beers diamonds and Cecil Rhodes, and you see the Matabele Wars, and you see the unaliving of massive numbers of black people. And this is also a period of time where Europeans now have what's called the maximal weapon. It is a machine gun that they use, and they literally mowed people down by the thousands with these machine guns. In addition to that, we can see in Southwest Africa what was called the Herero and Nyama genocides that took place in Southwest Africa by the Germans. And these were also the beginning of the major concentration camps that took place later in Germany. But they did this in what they call Shark Island as part of what they call the Shark Island Massacre at the turn of the century, in between 1900 and like 1906. And so we see millions of people during this period of time. And when we began to examine it, we look at the Lord Kitchener and coming into the Sudan, and then we look into South Africa, the wars that took place in subjugating black South Africa and taking control of their lands. And we can see something very similar to this all over the African continent, because there are about 79 slave ports along the west coast of Africa. And these ports, originally the Portuguese went along and they developed ports, and then what happened is it became a competition. And you had the French, you had the British, you had the Dutch, you had the numerous European groups competed for control of the African coast. And they went in, and not only did they establish these ports and forts, they were all forts, and they all had weapons pointed toward not only toward the ocean so that they could fight off their European competitors. They also had their weapons pointed inland to fight off the Africans. And so this was an occupation that took place along the coast. And of course, they had firearms and they had superior weapons and technology. And of course, as this occurred, this opened up the transatlantic slave trade for along the west coast of Africa. And so in terms of looking at this, there's so much additional detail that it's important to really, really understand. But we can see that over 100 million people were unalived on the African continent itself. And there were about 32.5 million Africans, sub-Saharan black Africans, taken into slavery and scattered around the world. And among this was a group of Africans taken to the Americas, and particularly to North America, where you have the African American or black American population today, which is about 46.9 to 50 million black people in America, in the United States of America. And so in terms of putting this in context and understanding the context of this, I think it's very critical, and also critical to understand the event of 1884, which was called the Berlin Conference. They call it the Great Petitioning. And it's when Africa, the African continent, was divided into colonial territories. And it was divided among European countries that took sections of Africa. You know, so you had you had French West Africa, you had British Guinea, you had the Belgian Congo, you had various sections of the African continent were divided amongst Europeans. And they sat down and they divided it up. But they still ended up fighting over it in World War I and World War II. But it's important to be able to recognize that the devastation of the African Holocaust, the trafficking of enslaved Africans, and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans was recently declared the gravest crime against humanity on March 25th, 2026, just a few days ago. And this was a major victory and a culmination of many, many years of effort by black people worldwide. Now, many people that are listening to the so-called leaders of FBA and all of that, they don't really understand the overall context or understand the history well enough to see it for what it is. They think, well, these are some people that are coming and they're trying to interfere with us and they're trying to take what's ours and what's entitled to, what they're entitled to. But the fact of the matter is that this issue of a reparations movement has been going on for quite some time, and there is a substantial amount of progress that has been made. And this event on March 25th, 2026, at the United Nations was a major victory and culmination of many years of work and many years of effort. And it is not just Ghana. Ghana was only a spokesperson for what's called the Africa Group, which was about 54 countries that are part of the United Nations that vote as a bloc. And Ghana just happened to be the spokesperson for this event this time. And so some of the people that are criticizing that they're confused because it's not Ghana alone. It's 54 independent African nations who are being represented by Ghana, and it also includes 13 independent Caribbean nations that have majority black population that vote as a bloc at the United Nations. It's also supported by a number of Asian nations that have worked with and supported the black nations that are in the United Nations. And so it's important to understand that the vote that took place, where there was 123 countries that voted in support of the resolution, that they represent this coalition. It's a global coalition, and most of these places have populations of black people that are the descendants of Africans, or they are involved in the interaction with the African continent in a positive way. The fact that only 3 countries voted no is also interesting, because the other 52 countries, those 52 countries, they could have voted no, but they did not vote no. They abstained from voting because they agreed in principle with most of what was written in the resolution. And I think the main thing that they were concerned about was that their countries would have to pay out substantial amounts of money as a result of this, and they were not going to take the political risk of being positioned where they voted for something that was going to cost their government substantial amount of money. But they didn't vote against it. So they agreed in principle generally, and most of them made some statements to that effect. So this was a major, major worldwide victory for Black people who suffered under the African Holocaust. And so let me just say that it's important for us to really examine how do we heal from this multi-generational trauma of the African Holocaust. Well, step one is acknowledge what happened. We have to not only acknowledge what happened, but we have to be accurate about what actually happened so that we are clear and have a clear understanding of what actually happened. And we do have a lot of groups in the Black community who are unclear about what happened. And there's a lot of disinformation circulating about what happened. And so there's a lot of confusion and a lot of people that don't really understand what's going on, and they're attacking each other and condemning each other. And a lot of this is being promoted by outside conservative groups that want to see the Black community divided. They don't want us to get together. They don't want us to acknowledge and recognize what really happened, because it would drive us to each other and put us together as one united group of people. And they don't want to see that happen. But the first step is to acknowledge what happened and to acknowledge what actually happened. The second step is we need to talk about what happened. Not only do we need to talk about what happened among ourselves, but we need to tell the whole world what happened, because many people in the world, they don't know the history. They don't understand what happened. And unless we can explain it and articulate what's happening, there will always be opposition to reparations for Black people. There will be opposition that will be designed to frustrate the healing of Black people worldwide, as well as Black people in America. And they will try to frustrate this because we're not really talking about what happened in any type of meaningful or coherent way to really explain what happened. And this is why it becomes so critical for us to talk about it, not only amongst ourselves, but also to tell the world about it and explain to them what happened, and to be able to talk about it with them so that we can have a meeting of the minds and understanding and expansion and growth in knowledge and understanding of what happened in the past. And then the third step in the healing process is to organize and take action to protect ourselves in the future so that we're no more victims, that we can heal. And in order for us to heal and become no more victims, we have to really fully understand the truth of what happened. Now, let me just share a couple of little things I think are critical to understanding. First of all, March 25th. Why was this event on March 25th, and what was so significant about March 25th? Well, in 1807, on March 25th, there was something called the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act of 1807. And this was an act that abolished the slave trade within the British Empire, and it also abolished the slave trade on the high seas, because British naval forces then enforced this prohibition on slave trafficking on the high seas. And this marked the beginning of the end of slavery in terms of it being something that involved the trafficking of people who were being taken from the African continent and transported around the world. So this event that took place on March 25th, 1807, there was a 200-year anniversary of this in 2007, and it was called the International Day of Remembrance. And on this International Day of Remembrance, it's very significant to recognize the fact that this was something that was promoted. This International Day of Remembrance was actually promoted by the African countries that are part of the United Nations. Now, of course, Black America, we're not an independent country, so we didn't have a seat on the United Nations in order to speak up for Black Americans. But there were multiple countries around the world that were African countries and Black Caribbean independent countries, and many of these countries that had Black populations also stood up, and they established something called the International Day of Remembrance. And it was the 200-year anniversary of the abolition of the Slave Trade Act of 1807. And during that year, they dedicated a monument called the African Burial Ground National Monument. And this African Burial Ground National Monument was actually built in Lower Manhattan at a African burial ground where some 15,000 Africans and descendants of Africans in America were interned or buried at this burial ground in Lower Manhattan, New York. Now, there were also similar grave sites or cemeteries in Queens and Bronx and other parts of New York. But this Lower Manhattan site was the largest site, and it was one of the most historically significant sites. And this memorial was actually constructed and built there by an artist known as Rodney Leon. So Rodney Leon was responsible for designing this African burial ground national monument, which included something that was known as a Ark of Return or similar. It was actually called the Door of Return in this particular monument. And so this was a dedication that took place in 2007. In 2015, at the United Nations headquarters in New York, there was another monument that was erected by the same artist, Rodney Leon, and it was called the Ark of Return. And it was actually dedicated on March 25th, 2015, at the United Nations headquarters. And this was the result of a coalition of African countries and Caribbean nations, independent countries, Black Caribbean countries that had like 90% or more populations that were of African descent. They actually commissioned and got this Ark of Return built and dedicated and sponsored the artists at the United Nations. And so this 2015 memorial became very, very significant. And so when we began to take a look at what happened, also around the same time between 2004 and 2009, dedicated to this event, this 200-year anniversary event, another artist was commissioned that was supported by this coalition of 54 independent African countries called the Africa Group and the 13 independent Black Caribbean nations that sometimes get referred to as CARICOM. What they did was they organized something and supported an artist who created something called the African or the Reconciliation Triangle. Now, this Reconciliation Triangle was dedicated to healing, and it involved 3 identical statues or monuments One was constructed in 2004 in Liverpool, England, because it was a major port where the African slave trade, the triangular trade, began in England. And then the ships then, would travel the triangular route. But in 2007, this an identical monument was erected in Richmond, Virginia in 2007. And then in 2009, an identical monument was dedicated in Ouidah, Benin, on the African continent. So these three major events or major monuments were established. They were created by a guy named Stephen Broadbent. And on each monument, it has the same identical inscription. It says, acknowledge and forgive the past, embrace the present, shape a future of reconciliation and justice. And so it was dedicated to promoting the ideal of healing and reconciliation, and was all part of a global effort that was going on, that I think that it's important for us to really get into and understand. And so as I go into this, this question comes. It says, why are African nations asking for reparations? So you have a lot of black people in America, particularly, they're saying, well, the Africans sold us into slavery, and why should they ask for reparations? It was us who were put into slavery. We should be getting reparations, not them, because they sold us into slavery. Well, that thinking represents it's a major misrepresentation of the actual truth. And what's happening is it is actually comes from propaganda that's promoted into the black community as a disinformation campaign to confuse black people so that black people don't really understand what happened. So I'm going to address that as we go on. Also want to address another point, and that is that some of these critics are saying, well, that the Ghana, they're asking for reparations to go to Ghana instead of the black people in America. Well, that's also a myth. That's not true. Ghana didn't ask for reparations from the United States, per se. They didn't, in other words, what they're doing has nothing to do with black Americans being able to get reparations independently or separately. This is part of a global effort, and I'm going to, hopefully we'll be able to see it all in context. And so it's a myth that is being created to say that they're trying to take away your script. They're trying to take away your bag, is what they're saying. And so in terms of, let's go into it. Let's take a look at it. First of all, if we look at the actual declaration, the declaration does not specifically speak just to the transatlantic slave trade. Though there's language in it about the transatlantic slave trade, it's not just about that. What the language actually says is that this resolution, and this resolution is A/80/L.48 is the actual resolution number. And its title is Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized Chattel Enslavement of Africans as the Gravest Crime Against Humanity. And so it doesn't make a specific statement about the transatlantic slave trade in the title, and it leaves open all of the slave trades that took place. Now, here's something that's very interesting, I think extremely important to understand. Well, first of all, if you look at all the African countries and you look at the Berlin Conference and you look at the history, the first thing you might realize is that no African country today exists that may have had any type of tangential involvement in the African slave trade. It just simply doesn't exist, because all the African countries, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, did not come into existence until after 1957. So it's important to be able to understand that and to recognize this as just a distinctive fact. It is also significant that there's no direct ask for reparations from Arab countries. Why? Who were heavily involved and actually took more black people into slavery, 20 million, than did the 12.5 million Europeans took. The reason that there's no ask there is because those countries no longer exist. The Ottoman Empire ended and was terminated in 1922. And it was after a major, event that took place, World War I. And when we look at the breakup, the countries that emerged after World War I is countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq and all of these countries. When we begin to really look at the history and understand the history, you can begin to really understand why the declaration is such as it is. And these are people who understood this. But when you hear folks that are saying stuff that's ridiculous, they don't have any concept of what actually happened, they should shut up and listen and learn about what happened, because they're ridiculous, right? But it's important to be able to look at and understand the whole context, because when you look at the issue of reparations and you look at the wealth generated from these nations, or from these programs, this slavery and the whole African Holocaust, where did the money and resources go? It built the foundation of Western capitalism. So the money is where? It's in the United States, it's in Britain, it's in France, it's in Belgium, it's in Germany, it's in Denmark and Sweden. It is in the European countries and communities. It's important to be able to recognize and understand this distinction. And in addition to that, there's a couple other things that I think become very, very critical to be able to understand and put into context. First of all, we often think of, that this is something that's brand new, and we think that black people in America, that we created this reparations movement. But the fact of the matter is that that's not quite true. And what I want to do is I want to point out a couple of things I think that can help us to put some things in context. First of all, in 1900, the first Pan-African conference was held, and it was held in London, England. And it was actually organized by a group of young blacks from Trinidad, from Antigua, from Sierra Leone, from South Africa, as well as from the United States, including W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And this first Pan-African conference that took place was an international forum of black people worldwide who came together, primarily from the British Empire, some also from the French Empire. And they got together and they talked about the conditions that existed in black communities worldwide. And what was going on at the time? There was atrocities being committed against blacks in the Congo by King Leopold. There were atrocities being committed against blacks in Southeast Africa by Cecil Rhodes. There were atrocities being committed in Southwest Africa by the Germans, and there was the Shark Island Massacre. All of these things are happening all around this time. In addition to that, there's forced labor going on in the Caribbean and in Central and South America. In the United States, there was Jim Crow segregation. There was lynching, and there were mob attacks on black communities that were taking place, like in Wilmington, North Carolina, where blacks got elected and got control of the mayor's office and the city council, and a YT mob attacked the city and burned and looted, destroying hundreds of houses and unaliving massive numbers of black people, in essence, a coup d'etat. And this is what was going on at the time. And so these black people got together and they spoke about it. And they created an international forum to talk about it. And it became part of what became known as the Pan-African movement. And this was Pan-Africanism in its birth at this conference in 1900. And then later, the Second Pan-African Conference, which actually is called the First Pan-African Congress, took place in 1919 at the close of World War I. And it took place in Paris, France. And it was organized by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as an international group of black people who had been involved in the First Pan-African Conference. And what they did was they actually petitioned and solicited the United Nations to actually provide protections for black people worldwide, in addition to how the German territories that were under the Germans that were on the African continent, how those would be managed and transitioned to independence. And so there was a big agenda in terms of what black people were doing, but it was a group of black people from all over the world that came together under the banner of Pan-Africanism and to speak up. And they had an impact in creating something in 1926. And of course, it took work, but it resulted in something called the Slavery Convention, which was a landmark international treaty that was adopted by the League of Nations. And this was done in 1926. And it came after there was a Pan-African Congress that took place in 1900, in 1921, in 1923. And then there was another that took place in 1927, the year after this took place. And then, of course, there was another one in 1945 that led to the African liberation movement. But it's important to be able to look at and understand the context of all of this. And then, of course, in 1941, there was something called the Atlantic Compact. And this is where Winston Churchill and where Franklin Delano Roosevelt from England and from the United States got together, and they pledged to establish the United Nations. This became the foundation of the United Nations for post-World War II. And they agreed that at the end of the war, that each country would not try to claim additional territory or take territory as a result of the war, and that they pledged independence and self-determination from countries that had been colonized and marginalized, and to bring about an end to the old order, the old system that took place. And so this resulted in the United Nations being born at the end of World War II. And this Atlantic Compact became the foundation of this UN Charter. And so by 1948, there was something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was established. And this Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually condemned slavery and declared that, slavery to be unlawful, that it was a crime against humanity, and it took certain positions, and it created, for the very first time in human history, an international legal convention that prohibited slavery worldwide and made it a matter of international order. And this became extremely significant. And there's a bunch of other steps because, for example, one of the people that had the greatest influence on this Universal Declaration coming into being was W.E.B. Du Bois, in a paper that was written under his leadership in the NAACP that was published worldwide. And this document had a major impact on getting this Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed. And then later in 1950, there was something called the Nuremberg Principles of Enslavement, was defined as a crime against humanity. And this was related to what happened in Germany during World War II. But it also was also part of what happened to Africans. Because remember, the very first concentration camps were in Southwest Africa and at Shark Island off the coast of Namibia. And so in terms of being able to understand all of this and put this in a context, it's important to recognize that this Universal Declaration of Human Rights ushered in a whole new world order. And it also ultimately resulted in 54 independent African nations coming to power. So that meant that you had 54 black countries with a seat on the United Nations. In addition to that, you had 13 independent black countries in the Caribbean have independence and obtain a seat at the United Nations. And so you now have a very significant representation of black people at the United Nations. And so by 1953, what they've done is in the United Nations, they're establishing this 1926 convention that was part of the League of Nations, that was the Slavery Convention. They've invoked that and now brought it into the United Nations. And so in 1954, they drafted a code of offenses. And then eventually they had what they called the supplementary conventions that dealt with, it outlawed serfdom, debt bondage, and child exploitation. And then ultimately you get into this period of decolonization. You got a bunch of things that took place. You have the Bandung Conference. You have a black man from Barbados known as Sir Grantley Adams. So he's from Barbados, and he's a key figure that argued about economic justice and that it is a human right. So he's arguing for reparations, arguing that economic justice is a human right. Now, this is a black man from Barbados, from the Caribbean. And so this is bringing the reparations issue center stage in the global discussion. In addition, there's Dr. Eric Williams, another black man. He's from Trinidad. And he comes forward and he wrote a book actually called Capitalism and Slavery. He actually became the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. And he talked about the crisis of capital, and he talked about the condition of economic injustice and about the need for reparations and the need for reparatory justice, the need for repair, and looking at and examining the conditions, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but looking at the conditions of black people throughout the Caribbean, Central and South America, in the United States, on the African continent, throughout the world of Asia. And so this is a global effort that's happening where you have black voices worldwide who are now leading the international reparations movement. And of course, you have some voices that are speaking from the black community in America. And primarily, some of these voices would be W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. In 1951, they actually issued a charge of genocide at the United Nations about the crimes against humanity, which was the slave trade and the Jim Crow segregation and the atrocities committed against black people in America. And so this brings black Americans as a leading voice in this reparations discussion. And of course, this has been an international effort that's been going on since 1900, involving many, many countries where there are black populations. And then many of these countries have become independent over time. And so when we began to look at this in 1960, the African bloc of nations, what they call the Africa Group, they gained enough votes to pass the very first declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. And so they got this thing passed, and it ultimately resulted in many Caribbean countries becoming independent that were majority black countries, that were colonies of Britain or colonies of France or colonies of various European countries. And they also began to label the apartheid system in South Africa as a crime against humanity and connected it to this overall global movement. And so by 1973, they established what was called the Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. And then by 1984, they established the Convention Against Torture, because all around the world, particularly in the Caribbean and Central and South America, and even in the United States, you had black people that were being beat by police. They were being shackled, and so you had a bunch of people that were unalived as a result of what they call restraint asphyxia, in custody unalivings. And also many black people were being forced to labor in various countries around the world. So this is a constant voice of black people worldwide observing what is going on globally. And they're speaking up. And by 1991, there's something called the Abuja Declaration. And this Abuja Declaration, it actually was organized and took place in Nigeria. And so African heads of state, they all came together and they formally resolved to seek reparations for the untold damages of the slave trade and colonialism, not to themselves, but that the people who were the victims of it. So they became spokespersons for the global reparations movement. And this is a coalition of African countries, of African heads of state. It involves a coalition of blacks from the Caribbean, from Brazil, from Colombia, from the United States, and from all over the world where there are black people who were part of the Pan-African movement and who had populations that were the descendants of slaves, who experienced slavery, who experienced segregation, who experienced marginalization and institutional racism that was all race-based, and it grew out of race-based chattel slave system. And so in 1998, the Roman Statute, they established something called the Roman Statute through the United Nations. And of course, you had this block of African countries and black Caribbean countries, as well as Asian allies, including China and many others. They actually got something established called the International Criminal Court. So now the International Criminal Court is established, and they've been setting up something. This Article 7 explicitly lists enslavement as a crime against humanity. So they are moving to build an international legal infrastructure to prosecute crimes against humanity, of enslavement, of race-based mistreatment of black people. So this has been something that they have legally engineered and structured and built into the United Nations over time. And this is also one of the reasons why Donald Trump is trying to withdraw the United States from the United Nations. because this is what's happening. And the legal structure has significantly changed. And the United States doesn't have the power to just dominate and do what they want anymore. And because of that, the United States now, with the white supremacy leadership, is trying to withdraw from it. But when we look at this history, in 2000, there was the beginning of the organization of a world conference against racism was actually planned for 2001 in Durban, South Africa, who by this time now South Africa is independent. So in 2001, the Durban conference was held, and it had 2,500 delegates from from like 170 countries. And in addition to it having 2,500 delegates from 170 countries, it also attracted about 18,000 people from around the world, including black people from America, the Caribbean, Central and South America, and all across the African continent. And part of what they did was they came together to talk about slavery, the aftermath of slavery, and about establishing slavery as a international crime against humanity, and to talk about reparations and reparative justice. And of course, at this Durban conference, the United States and Israel walked out, and they tried to create it as an event. And this was during the Bush administration, so that they tried to derail any effort. And then for at least the next 5 or 6 years, there were efforts to try to pass a resolution with strong language in it, and they were not able to build the consensus to put the really, really strong language in the declaration. And then, of course, you had, of course, the Durban Declaration was very significant. It was an international body of people supporting the issue about reparative justice, declaring slavery as a crime against humanity. So all those things were part of it, but didn't have the teeth kind of built into the legislation. So, of course, then in 2007, the International Day of Remembrance came. The United Nations established 2015 to 2024 as the International Decade of the People of African Descent. So, in other words, for the whole next decade, we're going to talk about history. We're going to talk about what happened. We're going to memorialize, and then, of course, you had CARICOM. You had the Africa Union push. You had all of these things that took place. And then you began to have different apologies that came out and all that. But no substantive, no money, just apologies and all that that's taking place in different countries. And, of course, this 2026 event was a major event because it established the strongest language that has come into any of the UN resolutions so far to push this issue forward about reparative justice. And this call for reparative justice actually takes many different forms. It's not just saying that, give us money. It's about funding education. It's about eliminating barriers to opportunities. It's about creating an international environment of healing and reconciliation and opportunity to build community. And so this is a very significant event. And then in addition to that, they also established something called the Decade of Action on Reparations and African Heritage. That is established from 2026 to 2036. So this next 10-year period that we're already in is this decade of action on reparations and African heritage. And so there are plans. So CARICOM has plans in the Caribbean. The Africa Union has plans. And there are multiple international groups working together. So there are reparations movements that are going on in the Caribbean right now. There are reparations movements going on in Brazil, in Colombia, in all over the world. There are black people in Asian countries where black people were taken and enslaved in Asian countries during the Arab slave trades. And you have all of these communities that are coming together, that are becoming more and more conscious of each other, understanding the global condition, and they are working toward building this coalition, this global unification. And the Western stance has been, they argue that slavery was a historic wrong, but was not illegal in the 17th and 18th century, and cannot be made so retroactively. That's their argument. But countries of the global south, the African continent, Caribbean, etc., they argue that the chattelization of human beings is a violation of the principle of what's called just cogens. And just cogens is it's a peremptory norm. In other words, what it's saying is that it transcends written law. In other words, they're saying, look, this is the kind of crime you can't pass a law to make it legal. It is inherently illegal. It's a crime against humanity. It is such moral degradation. It's like the crime of murder. There's no statute of limitations on murder, and there's no statute of limitations. And what they've done is they've worked to establish an international legal framework to say that there is no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity. There is no statute of limitations on this action of enslavement of black people based upon racialized chattel slavery. You can't say that you're not responsible because it happened so many years ago, and that that somehow you don't have to do anything about it because it happened long ago and you're not the one responsible in this generation, and it was legal back then. That's irrelevant, is what they're saying. They're saying in an international framework, under the international system, that it is just cogents, that you couldn't make a law to make it legal back then. So any law that made it legal is irrelevant. It's not something you could legally do. It's a desecration of the image of God in man. And humans can't do that. You don't have the capacity to do that. And so you can be held accountable, especially if you're still holding the money. And what's happening is the money is traceable to institutions in the United States. It's traceable to institutions across the European continent. And what they're saying is, look, you've done this damage to black people. We can look at it, we can measure it, and we can see worldwide poverty in the black community, undereducation. We can see the kinds of problems that exist in black communities worldwide and on the African continent that are the result of this enslavement that took place, this racialized enslavement, this disinformation, this lie about white supremacy, that all of these things that took place, there is no statute of limitations for it. That these countries who are still holding the resources, you have a responsibility for reparative justice. You have a responsibility to make it right. You have a responsibility to engage in corrective action. And so this becomes extremely significant in terms of being able to understand where we are historically in this. And there's a couple other little dimensions to this I want to bring out. I think it's extremely important that some folk may not understand. And that is that, for example, the question comes, okay, why are African countries asking for reparations? Well, first of all, let's take a look at, say, a country like Ghana, which is one of the countries that, that they focused on, to try to attack. And I want to address this because I just think that it's important to expand our understanding. First of all, if you look at what is now Ghana today, it has a population of about 35.7 million people. It occupies a landmass there on the Atlantic coast of West Africa. And the population that's there consists of, there's a group of people called the Akan people. The Akan are reportedly descendants from ancient Ghana, who migrated, of course, when when Islam attacked Ghana. Many black people fled south and they settled along the area that is now the landmass called Ghana, and because ancient Ghana was further north. Okay. And one of the reasons they call it Ghana today, because of the percentage of population there that actually migrated from the original Ghana. So you have this group of people of the Akan people. Now, of the Akan people, there are many different groupings of the Akan people, including one smaller grouping called the Ashanti. And the issue becomes the Ashanti people actually built a coalition with the Europeans and were involved for a short period of time involved in the slave trade until what they call the Anglo African Wars, and this, or the Anglo Ashanti Wars. And these these Anglo Ashanti Wars, the British actually came in and they unalived massive numbers of Ashanti people, most of those who had been involved at some point with the slave trade and all of that. So when we look at Ghana itself, you got the Akan people, and you only have one small subgroup within them called the Ashanti people. You have the Dagbami people, and you had a small group of them who may have been involved in slave trading at some point. But of course, their slave trading was not chattel slavery. They were involved in it because they took people as slaves, and the slaves married their daughters. They interacted and became part of their community. They just took warring tribes or people that they conquered and they absorbed them into their group. And it wasn't chattel slavery. You have the We people, the EWE, in the southeast region. You have the Dengabi people that are in part of near Accra and the greater part of the country. You have the Goan people, who they are spread across the country as well now. And then, of course, you have the Jorma and the Grusi people that are in the northern and upper regions. And you have multiple other ethnic groups of black people in Ghana. And so what FBA is saying is that, okay, that they mistakenly believe that Ghana, which did not exist as a country, that they sold black people into slavery, when you have a very, very small subgroup of people who were involved in the slave trade for a short period of time, but they became involved only after being physically subjugated, terrorized by YT people with weapons. And then, of course, they acquiesced and became involved for a period of time. This is very similar to what happened in a lot of other places in Africa, but it's important to look at it from Ghana because we have people criticizing the president of Ghana, saying that, well, the president of Ghana, they're trying to take black people's bag. So when we actually take a look at it, we see a small group of people involved in the slave trade in Ghana, and we see all of these other ethnic groups not involved, who were the victims, and many of these are our ancestors who are here today. And now they were not only subject to the atrocities that were committed against them because they got attacked in the Anglo Ashanti Wars, because Britain didn't distinguish who's an Ashanti, they just unalived black people. And so when you begin to really take a look at what's happening there, atrocities were committed against them directly on the continent in their home where they lived in Ghana. And many of their relatives and family members were snatched and taken into slavery and brought to the Americas and enslaved. They were brought and taken to other parts of Central and South America, in the Caribbean, and taken as slaves. So to believe that this group somehow, that Ghana actually is trying to take our script, and they're trying to, it's just so ridiculous, and it reflects a level of ignorance that we must correct. And so this is why it becomes so important for us to talk about this, because we've got to wake up and help some of these people understand, because they're talking pure nonsense, and they are the enemies of black people, because they're working against the interests of black people, not only in the United States, but black people worldwide. Because they're supporting some of the same people who is adamantly against giving black people reparations in America. And so they are working against our own interests, pretending that they somehow are for us. And so, you trademark the name FBA. So it's like you own the FBA, you own black people, It's like Stephen on Django. He is the quintessential, the most despicable Negro in history, is how it's described as. And that's what we're dealing with. And so in terms of looking at and understanding that along the coast of Ghana, there are 40 castles that were set up. And these 40 castles, they not only had weapons pointed out at the ocean to fight off Europeans who may try to take over their business, they had weapons pointing inward to the African population. They were a hostile occupying group that took place. They forced their way into trade. And so many people don't really understand this history, because it's critical to be able to look at and try to really, really understand, And I mean, we could go into, and we actually do a course where we'll talk about Elmina Castle and its history, and Christiansborg Castle and its history, and Cape Castle and its history. And, we actually do a somewhat detailed presentation and discussion about what happened there, as well as what happened in other places like at Badagry in Nigeria, Goria Island off the coast of Senegal, and Bimbia in Cameroon, and we talk about a lot of that information, but it's the subject of a whole different presentation. But there were forts that were developed. Of course, Elmina Castle and Cape Castle and Fort Amsterdam and Fort Fredericksburg, out of about 40 different forts, Fort Sebastian, and all these were developed at different times. And most of these forts that were developed, that were heavily involved in the actual slave trade, were there, and physical violence was used to bring black people into slavery long before the Ashanti tribe became an independent tribe. And most people don't even know that. They don't understand that you got almost 200 years or more that takes place where this slave trading is taking place before the Ashanti Empire actually comes into existence. And so it's important to understand this, because evidently some of the folks in the FBA, they don't really understand the actual history. So they jump to conclusions, and they say ridiculous things that really don't make a lot of sense, And when we look at this, the African Burial Ground National Monument, the burial ground itself, there was over 400 and something remains excavated by a team from Howard University in Washington, D.C. They did DNA testing. They looked at artifacts in the gravesite and all those, and they concluded who the people were. They were Africans and people of African descent. They found Ndrinka symbols in the graves, and all of these kinds of things. And it's part of I think an important and critical study to understand what actually happened. And so here's the thing I want to kind of wrap up with. is that when we look at the African countries, you have to remember that, for example, for Ghana itself, okay, they have a bunch of artifacts that are in the British Museum right now. There are over 200 items of jewelry, of gold, ceremonial swords, all types of cultural artifacts that are part of the culture, not only of the Ashanti people, but of many different African tribal groups on within Ghana itself. And so these were looted by the British and are now in like the British Museum. They're in multiple other museums. They have what they call the Royal Gold ornaments. They're located at Victoria and Albert Museum in London. In addition to that, you've got the what they call the golden stool ornaments and jewelry, and there's 7 royal items there that are part of the heritage. Some of these items are worth, actually, if you auction them off in the market, they'd be worth billions of dollars, millions or billions of dollars. And so these countries are asking, as part of reparations, they're demanding the return of their artifacts. They're demanding the return of their artifacts that were stolen by the British, by the French, by the Dutch, by the Portuguese, by the Spanish, by various different European countries, looted their cultures and took their artifacts, their history, took ancient manuscripts and all kinds of things that are now being held and housed. Some of these things have even been hidden in storage facilities in the British Museum that have never even been made public. And so when we began to look at and understand this entire process, you've got, like, for example, you've got Nigeria. They have Benin bronzes. They have thousands of brass plaques in ivory sculptures that were taken to Britain and Germany when they were attacked. Ethiopia, you've got a bunch of royal treasures that were looted, golden crowns and chalices and religious manuscripts, and that were seized by British troops in 1868. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, you got thousands of statues, masks that were taken during the time of Leopold in the Belgian Congo. Then, of course, I already mentioned about Ghana, and then in Benin, the former Dahomey. There are what they call the Abomey treasures. They have royal thrones, statues. They have doors that were looted by the French forces in 1892. And in Zimbabwe, they have what they call the Zimbabwe birds, which are artifacts there. And they have the soapstone carvings that were taken from the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, a major international historical site where they took artifacts from there and took them to the British Museum. In Namibia, you have the ancestral remains and jewelry taken. They even took the ancestors out of the ground who were historical figures, who were ornamented with jewelry and all kinds of stuff. They took them out of the ground and took them to the British Museum and other European museums, right? And so black people are saying, look, bring this stuff back. These are our things that are part of our heritage, part of our culture. Return these things as part of reparations. In Cameroon, they have a bunch of sacred carvings, and they were taken by the Germans in something called the Ngwome. The Lumba statue was taken. You also have artifacts and manuscripts taken from Senegal. You have sacred ceremonial swords taken from Senegal. From Tanzania, there are dinosaur fossils that Africans had discovered that were taken from Africans, where black people were studying, and they took their artifacts. And in Mali, manuscripts and various different types of artwork. In addition, in Madagascar, they have the royal artifacts and the crown of the queen there in Madagascar that was taken to France. And when you began to look at this, you're talking literally billions of dollars worth of treasures that were taken from the African continent that are now housed in museums all around the world, and particularly in Europe. And so part of the movement just demanding reparations or asking for reparatory justice, which includes the return of the artifacts that were taken from African countries. And this is consistent with Professor Cheikh Anta Diop argued that we must rescue and reconstruct Black history, not on a protest posture, not based upon myths and half-truths, but it must be based upon facts and empirical evidence. And because that which happened in the past and that which we believe happened in the past conditions the living present and therefore the future. So history is not a dead thing. It's alive. And we have to be grounded in reality. And this is why we have to understand the history for what it actually is. And so in bringing this to a close, you can go today and there are major areas for example, in London where they have giant, huge mansions. You got like 50,000 square foot mansions, and you got all of these properties that were built based upon people that made a fortune in the slave trade. You have these wealthy homes and wealthy families, and you have the banking system. You have all of these industries that develop. And what's happened is they have developed a white privilege system around the globe built on the backs of Black enslavement, built upon the crimes against humanity that were committed against Black people. And Black people worldwide have been organizing for this for many, many years, not just in Black America. And Black America is not even the first one to begin this. This is something that has been an international movement for quite some time. And it's important for Black Americans to understand the context, because by Black people pulling away and trying to take a selfish position and say that, well, we're only the ones entitled to, and dividing ourselves, it is the strength of the international movement of Black people, the Pan-African movement, the worldwide movement of Black people, that has resulted in any success that we've had in this country. There would have been no civil rights movement success in America if it had not been for the African liberation movement, if it had not been for Pan-Africanism that resulted in the rise of 54 independent Black countries. And America found itself where it had to dance to the tune of Black people who now control the resources of the African continent that they relied upon to fuel their industrial economy. So they gave concessions of civil rights to Black Americans. And many people, they don't understand the role that Africa played. They don't understand the role of the international Black community because they don't really know the history. So you've got a lot of people who are just misinformed. So we don't want to be mad with them, and we don't want to, we don't want to be mad with them because they're our brothers. They're just ignorant. They just don't understand. And we really should feel sorry for them and try to embrace them and teach them and educate them. And hopefully we can bring them out of the ignorance of slavery, because it's part of being a slave. They're still in a slave mentality. And in order for us to rise above the mentality of slavery and move into a new realm, a new era, so that we are healed, that we're experiencing the healing powers of understanding our history and being part of the international coalition to bring about change. That's how we heal ourselves. And Black America is unlikely to ever get reparations in a vacuum. If Black people get reparations, it's going to be because there is international pressure for reparations, to give Black people in America reparations. And it'll be within a context. And what you'll see is that reparations not only is just something in terms of from the American government, but there's a deep misunderstanding of where the money went and who's holding the resources that were generated from slavery, because that's where you have to look worldwide, because it's such a complex situation. And this is one of the reasons why when Congressman John Conyers drafted H.R. 40, the reparations bill, calling for a study commission, the reason he called for a study commission is because the discussion and debate during that time, it rose to the level to make it very clear that there needs to be more study. We need to really look at it and understand so that we can make distinctions and understand how this has to be done. I'm going to close with this. Walter Rodney, in about 1971, wrote a book entitled How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And of course, Walter Rodney's book became a landmark book, a landmark study that impacted the global reparations movement. And it helped to educate Black people worldwide to be able to understand and put in context the global issue of reparation for the descendants of Africans who had been part of the African Holocaust, not only on the continent, but also of the African diaspora, those Blacks who had been taken into slavery, not only in America, but throughout the world. So with that, my purpose is to share this information that can contribute to our healing, to our understanding. And there's a saying that says that, when we look at the monuments or whatever that were developed, and they talk about forgiving, it's important for us to learn to forgive. But we also have to be cautious that if they don't repent, and then we can expect that they will continue to try to continue the same kind of behavior. And I think the fact that 123 countries voted in favor, we can see a large and significant level of people that are for this, that are ready to repent for any involvement they may have had. But we also have a lot of other countries and a lot of work to do so that others will repent of their role in this and engage in reparative justice. And so let's continue to talk about this, and let's continue to learn about this. Be blessed. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for taking the time to listen.